Brian Barnett is just a regular guy. He's not a doctor. He has no legal license in any field of mental or emotional health. Brian Barnett merely shares the insights he's gained from his personal experiences for anybody who may choose to use such information as he or she personally chooses, while accepting full responsibility for his or her own individual thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and actions. Brian Barnett assumes no responsibility whatsoever for anybody's individual choice to expose himself or herself to any information that Brian Barnett shares, and by listening to this program, you're acknowledging that you, and only you, are responsible for your own thoughts, feelings, and actions. Happy Thursday, everybody. Welcome back to The Last Symptom. I'm Brian Barnett, the creator and host. Want to encourage you, if you haven't, or if it's been a while, run over to thelastsymptom.com. That's my website full of free resources. And while you're there, if you'd like to leave me a donation, you can to support my overall body of work, which includes this podcast. Also, if you're interested in a one-on-one conversation with me, you can schedule that right from thelastsymptom.com. How's your week going? My week is going all right, I reckon. Here's the thing. If you'll remember last week, I talked about having a cold. Well, I think it was the flu. And when I recorded last week's episode, I thought I was done with it. I thought I was over it. But apparently, I was mistaken because I'm still dealing with some congestion, feeling a little run down. You may hear me clearing my throat a lot during this show. You may hear me sneezing or sniffling. I ask you to forgive me for that. I'll tell you, having the flu sucks big time any time of year. But in the summer, when it's 90 degrees and it's humid, I think it's worse. I think it's even worse. And that's what we've been having here the last couple of weeks. Temperatures in the mid-90s. I think yesterday it got up to like 94 or 95, something like that. I even took my fishing pole out to the lake the other day, right around sunset, and even the fish are too hot to want to eat. So that was a big failure. If you hear some background noise, a hum or a little buzz in the background, that's my air conditioner. I'm just not willing to turn it off to do this show. We're going to do the show with that little hum in the background. If you hear it, I don't know if the microphone's picking it up. What I've done is I've carried all my stuff to a far corner of my house away from the air conditioner, hoping that the microphone won't pick up the sound of it. Hey, I want to tell you a story, and this is for everybody in my education group. As those of you who are in the group know, the group is now over a year old, and in that time, I've had to remove a lot of people from the group for various reasons. I've got the rules plainly listed in there when people violate those rules, especially some of the simpler ones. I have kind of a zero tolerance policy on several of those rules. One of the rules, anybody who expresses any kind of suicidal idealization, that's an immediate ban. I don't want that on my group. I don't want that responsibility. It's not my responsibility anyway, but what I'm saying is that people who are already emotionally unhealthy will tend to view that as my responsibility when they put that on my group. And what I'm saying is that it's not my responsibility, and I accept no responsibility. Anybody who's feeling that way has just as much ability as I do to look up the appropriate numbers and the appropriate resources for help. And I view it as really disrespectful when somebody comes onto my group, which is as an education site, and attempts to thrust that responsibility on me against my will. Here's what I'm thinking. This is what I want to do to myself. I want to hurt myself, and I'm going to thrust that responsibility upon you now against your will to figure out what to do about it. Well, no, I'm not having any of that. None of that. That's one of those rules that I have a zero tolerance policy on. Another one is anybody who posts outside links, because I simply don't, especially lately, I don't have time to go around researching, following all of these links, listening to the authors of these links, and sorting out whether or not they're including erroneous concepts or distorted thinking in the things that they're teaching people. Obviously, I don't have time to follow all of these links and vet these people, check them out and make sure that the information that they're providing people harmonizes with what I know to be true. Don't have time to do that. So that's another zero tolerance policy that I've had. People who have posted outside links, typically it has resulted in an immediate ban from the group. Now, that may seem cold, and I can understand why people would think that it's cold of me to so concretely enforce those rules. But isn't it true that recovery begins with self-responsibility? That's where it begins. It begins with not making excuses for our failures or for our actions or failure to act. So me enforcing those rules, first of all, me expecting that when you come into the education group, that you will take responsibility for yourself to familiarize yourself with the rules, and then do your best to observe those rules and respect them, which they're not difficult rules. But this is step number one in my technique for helping people in the best way that I can. It's step number one. Ground zero is when you come in, I expect you to familiarize yourself with the rules and then to respect them. So over the last year and a bit, I've knocked a lot of people out of the group. Now, here's the thing to remember. Even when it's necessary for me to remove somebody from the group, it's a pretty minor thing. Because if their interest in their recovery is genuine, they still have access to this weekly podcast, which I produce for free, and that, forms the basis, really, of a lot of conversations that happen in my group. But they also have access to all of the resources I provide at thelastsymptom.com. So, getting removed from the education group really is not that big of a deal. It's kind of a slap on the wrist, and it's in people's best interests that I do that. It's maybe hard for some people to understand that, but truly, my doing that is a way of helping them. It forces them to recognize that they're responsible for themselves, that there are consequences for ignoring certain boundaries. And holding them to these concrete boundaries is something that most people with borderline personality disorder are not accustomed to. So I'm helping them experience what that's like. The reason I bring all this up is because I wanted to tell a story. Aside from my own education group, I'm a member of another group that has nothing to do whatsoever with emotional health. Instead, it's got to do with woodcraft, survival in the outdoors. So I'm part of this group, and earlier this week, I was interested in a particular knife that the founder of this group was selling on his website. Beautiful knife, big, I think it's 5.5-inch blade, full tang knife, high carbon steel, like a 3/16 inch spine on the back, 90-degree spine. I was interested in buying it. So I went to his website, and I could not find the knife. The knife is called a PKS, a mountain lion. So I'd been eyeballing this knife for a good year, and it was kind of a larger purchase. I mean, it was over $100 knife. Been kind of sitting on it and waiting for the right time, and I decided this week that I'd kind of like to get that knife and add it to my kit for when I'm in the woods. So I couldn't find it on the website. So what I did was I went into the group, and I said on the group in my post, I've been watching this knife for a while, and I was hoping to buy it, and I listed the website. And so I just asked, are they not making this knife anymore? Is this knife not available? Well, I got blocked from the group. I got booted out for 24 hours. And I said, what in the world? What did I do wrong? And there the moderator had included an explanation that according to the group rules, members cannot include links to websites that are not their own website. In other words, if I had included a link to my website, a website that I personally own, it would have been okay. But members cannot post links that are not their own website. The thing about this is that the link I posted is the owner of this group's own website. In other words, I was supporting his website. And they still kicked me out of the group for 24 hours. Even if you're supporting the owner's own website, they still enforce the rule that you cannot post links to websites which are not your website. What do you reckon my initial reaction was to being kicked out of the group? Well, I wasn't happy about it. I was miffed. And then when I read the reasons why I had been kicked out of the group, I was even more miffed. My initial reaction was, that is the stupidest thing I have ever heard in my entire life. That was my initial reaction. And then I sat on it for a little bit. And then I imagined all of the people that I've kicked out of the group, out of my group, over the past year for having violated my rules. And I got a pretty good sense of what they probably felt when I did that to them, or when my moderators did it to them. And the more I thought about it, the more I began to accept the fact that this group that I got kicked out of for 24 hours has every right to set their rules. It's my responsibility to be familiar with the rules. It's not their responsibility to make sure that I'm familiar with their rules. It's my responsibility when I joined their group to be familiar with their rules and to respect those rules, right? So my frustration with them, it didn't go away immediately, I'll be honest with you. But at the same time, I had to respect I had failed in my responsibility, and the consequences just were what they were. Now, I'll tell you this, I did appreciate that they didn't ban me from the group for all time. They simply kicked me out for 24 hours. But the experience did teach me what it feels like to be in that situation. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to unban anybody who's been banned in the past, except for maybe a couple of exceptions of people who really crossed the line. But I'm going to open it up to everybody again. I just want to say I'm doing this in the spirit of knowing just how much it stings, how much it stings initially to be kicked out of a group, even when it's for reasons that you are responsible for, and it has to do with your own failure to respect the rules of that group. It still stings, and it's not easy to just accept that the consequences are simply the consequences of your own failure. So what I'm not saying is that the people that I've removed from the group in the past did not bring that upon themselves. They did bring it upon themselves, but I appreciated it. For example, in my own experience here with this survival group that I'm a part of, I appreciated that they didn't remove me permanently. They gave me, they kicked me out for 24 hours so that I'd get the message, which I did, and then they allowed me to be back in the group. And I appreciated that very much. I appreciated it so much that I'm going to try to incorporate that into the way that I moderate my own group and the way that my moderators moderate my own group. All right, so that's the story I wanted to kick off things with today. Now, speaking of my group, there was a topic that I had posted about months ago, but as each new week brings in new members, people have discovered this post, and it has risen again to the top of the conversation that's going on this week. So I wanted to share it with everybody here because I thought that it was a pretty important conversation to have and helpful, probably helpful to a lot of you listening out there. And this conversation has to do with inherent worth as it relates to shame. So we're going to talk about it here for everybody's benefit. And this conversation started with a member posting this. She says, "I'm living with my parents in my hometown. I sit around all day thinking and feeling bad about myself, criticizing myself for not being like others." And if I remember correctly, there was a lot more to this post, but this is just the part that I seized upon and replied to. And so it's the part that I'm sharing with you today. It seemed to be the main topic, of her concerns. Let me read it again. She says, "I'm living with my parents in my hometown. I sit around all day thinking and feeling bad about myself, criticizing myself for not being like others." So, here's what I had to say to her to try to help her focus upon the real issue of the matter. I said, "What you feel is shame because of what you believe about your inherent nature. You see, feeling bad about yourself is shame. Comparing yourself to others is a symptom of shame." Do y'all recall what the difference is between guilt and shame? See if you can notice the difference. Guilt says, "I did something wrong. I did something wrong." Shame says, "I am something wrong." Do you see the difference? That's the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt says, "I made a mistake. Got to fix that. I got to do better next time." Shame says, "You're a mistake. You yourself are the mistake." You see how guilt is always constructive, because guilt always moves us to view the matter as something that we've done that we can do differently in the future. Whereas shame attacks us, we ourselves, as people, the very nature of who we are, of what we are. There's no fixing what you just are. So if you view yourself as being what is wrong, there's no fixing that, because it has to deal with how you perceive your inherent nature. Whereas, if you're feeling bad about something you've done, you recognize that you can do it differently moving forward. That's guilt. You see how constructive guilt can be, and how destructive shame is. Now, when we talk about the inherent nature of something, it's important to understand the nuance of what this implies. Shame tells you that you naturally lack any inherent worth. It says that your natural inherent state is that you're just devoid of value, that this is the natural reality of your natural state. So with that in mind, let's go back to her comment. She says, "I sit around all day thinking and feeling bad about myself." Do you see how that's shame? She's not feeling bad about something she's done or something that she's failed to do. What she's saying is she feels bad about herself. Do you see how that's the very definition of shame? Feeling bad about yourself is shame. They're the same. They're one and the same. There's no difference. If I feel bad about myself, that's shame. Because shame says you are what's wrong. Not anything you've done or failed to do, but you yourself. So when you catch yourself feeling bad about yourself, recognize that that's shame and it's a lie. The message coming from the shame is a lie. She also says she criticizes herself for not being like others. Well, again, this is just a natural result of shame. When you see yourself as the problem, which is shame, what's that lead to? Does it lead to praising yourself for all of your great qualities? No. What it leads to instead is critical thinking toward yourself. Critical, hateful thinking. Shame is a lie. The messages in that feeling, in that emotion, is a lie. And if you'll remember in the past, I've explained how guilt is always constructive and shame is never constructive. Of all of our emotions, now remember, we can't say emotions are good or bad, right or wrong. Feelings never are good or bad, right or wrong. But we can say that they're constructive or non-constructive. And in this case, shame is the only feeling that human beings experience which is always non-constructive. It serves no constructive purpose whatsoever, and it's the only feeling that we can say that about. Every other feeling serves a constructive purpose, except for shame. Now, think about little babies. Let's think about brand new born babies. How many of them do you think are born naturally devoid of value? How many babies out there being born today, for example, do you think are being born with their natural state being one that is devoid of value? How many of all the thousands of babies being born today? If you think about it and you're honest with yourself, you know that it's zero. 0 babies are born devoid of value. 0. Including you. All right? Devoid of value is not a human being's natural state. All people are born with worth. Worth is a natural quality of all human beings. It's just part of being a human being. When you're born, you have worth. You have value. You're born with it. It's an inherent part of what makes you a person. So, having value is our natural state. What does this mean? It means it's our natural state regardless of anything. We don't have to do anything at all to earn it. And we rely on no external factor to supply it to us. It doesn't matter what family you're born into, where you're born, what nation you're born into, what race you're born into. It doesn't matter at all. All human beings, when they're born, just naturally have value. It's part of being a person. So, while you may understand this superficially when I tell it to you, it's not something that you truly believe deep down if you're a person who sits around feeling bad about yourself. How do I know this? Well, I know it because the natural effect of a person knowing they have inherent worth is that they're secure, confident, and they don't dislike themselves or feel bad about themselves. Think about that. If you're a person who deep down in your unconscious belief system If your perspective on life is that you have inherent worth, you don't have to earn it, it's just part of being a person, what is the natural result of that? What kind of attitudes and behaviors would that translate into? Well, we don't have to imagine it. We can see it in people. And it naturally translates into people who are secure, confident, and who don't dislike themselves. They genuinely like themselves. It's just like anybody else that you might like or dislike, you know? I've talked in the past about how people with borderline personality disorder, one of the causes of their anger is that it's like they're stuck in an office without windows, a tiny little office, 24 hours a day with some office partner or office worker that they just can't stand. That person drives them bonkers. They really dislike that person. Can you imagine being trapped in a tiny little office day in and day out with somebody that you just simply cannot stomach? Well, that's the person with borderline personality disorder. Very, very frustrating. The irony being, of course, that person in the office is you. So you're stuck with yourself. We all are. We're all stuck with ourselves. And that's the opposite of what I'm describing here. A healthy person is stuck with somebody that they genuinely enjoy the company of. Think about that. So imagine yourself being stuck every day with somebody whose company you genuinely enjoy. What kind of attitudes and behaviors would that translate into? It would translate into you being a secure individual, confident individual. Not somebody who feels bad about herself or himself, but somebody who actually enjoys the company that they're stuck with every day. The natural effect of shame, that is, of not believing you have inherent worth, but instead believing that your worth is dependent on external factors, the natural effect, what this translates into, is exactly what you would imagine it to translate into. It translates into people who dislike themselves. You can't view yourself. Your perspective, your underlying perspective can't be that you're devoid of inherent worth, and yet you still like yourself. That doesn't translate into liking yourself. You see, people who live with this idea, this erroneous idea, that they have to earn their worth, that they don't have it naturally, these people dislike themselves. They make comparisons with themselves to others. They feel empty inside. They're constantly on the search for something to fulfill them, something external. For example, they're compelled to make achievements as a way to earn some value as people. They often feel sad and lonely, even when they have many relationships in their lives. They have huge families, 1 million friends, and yet they still feel empty. Why is that? Because those are external things. External things cannot make up for inner things. And people, as we talked not too long ago, people who are genuinely content or, live healthy, harmonious lives, these are people who generate it from within. And the way they do that is that their perception, their fundamental, their underlying perspectives of life are that they have inherent worth. That's where it all comes from. Now, I'd like you to pay a special attention to this part right here. And I want you to think hard about this. Maybe even make a note of it or two. I want you to notice that people who know that their worth is an inherent quality, these people live happy, healthy lives. It's the natural result of living with that belief, is that their lives are happy, healthy, and harmonious. On the other hand, people who don't believe deep down that they have inherent worth, what are their lives like? People who do not believe deep down that they have inherent worth, their lives are naturally sad, angry, frustrated, and disordered. What should this tell you? It should tell you that the idea that people have inherent value is reality. It's the truth. It's not a religious truth. It's a fact. And the idea that we do not have inherent value is false. Why should it tell you this? Why should the fact that people who live with one belief live happy, harmonious lives, and the people who live with the other belief live disordered lives, why should that tell us, why should it prove to us that people having inherent value is a reality? Because of this. You would expect the truth, the true belief, to harmonize with life. Right? If it's the truth, it will harmonize with the broader reality of things. And you would expect for the false belief, the one that does not properly describe the broader reality, to be disharmonious with life. Did you catch that? That's your proof right there for why you have an inherent value is a reality, not a religious reality, just a reality. It properly describes the reality of the matter. And why is that? Because an accurate perspective on the reality would lead to harmony with reality. A false perspective on the matter would lead to disharmony with reality. And all we got to do is look out at people of the two groups we've described and see what their lives are like. Which group seems to be having and enjoying the more harmonious life? Which group seems to be having the life that more greatly harmonizes with the reality we all live in? Isn't it the people who subconsciously believe that they have inherent worth? Yes. It's this belief that harmonizes with the broader reality, with life. So for those of you who would like to argue that this is a religious concept, you're full of shit. I've just proven that you're full of shit. It's a no-brainer. People who live with the fundamental belief, the fundamental perspective that they're just born with inherent worth, this belief translates into harmony in their life with reality. They live happy, they're content, they're secure. And when we look at the other side, the people who believe the opposite, that they do not have inherent worth, that they have to earn their worth, that their worth is based on external things, they don't live happy lives. They live frustrated lives. Their lives don't harmonize with reality. Their lives are naturally disharmonious with reality. All right? So the reason I bring that up is because I had somebody in my group who, by the way, I had to boot out of the group, and he won't be invited back, who got onto my group and began spouting off this bullshit that the concept of inherent worth is a religious lie. That it's just religious baloney. Clearly, as I've just clearly explained, that is not true. That guy's full of shit. He's a problem for himself, and he's a problem for anybody who chooses to listen to him and believe him. But I've just refuted his argument pretty concretely, I believe, and I hope that you'll give that point that I just explained special consideration and spend the week thinking about it. Everybody has value as a natural part of being a person. Nobody has to recognize you have value because it's inherent. It's an inherent quality to you. It's always there, whether anybody recognizes it or not. It's even there whether you yourself ever recognize it or not. Now, for those of you who are struggling with shame, let's talk about how to eliminate it. The following is the recipe for eliminating shame. Number 1, you first have to understand, without any uncertainty, what shame is. You have to be able to recognize it when it's happening. All right? That's step number 1. You have to understand without any uncertainty what shame is. That means being able to distinguish it from guilt and from regret. Guilt says, I did something wrong. It's that simple. Guilt just says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I'm what's wrong. Regret is just simply, if you had a chance to do something differently, you would. All right? That's the distinguishing factor between those three things. Let's say it again. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Easy peasy, right? Shame says, I am wrong. I'm what's wrong. And regret is simply, if you had a chance to do something differently, you would do it differently. That's all. Can a person feel regret without feeling shame or guilt? Yes. I bought a backpack not too long ago from Walmart, and then I lost the receipt. I regret buying the backpack because it's not really what I was looking for. And I regret losing the receipt. Do I feel guilty for having bought the backpack? No, I don't feel guilty about it. Do I feel shame for buying the backpack? No, I don't feel bad about myself. I don't feel like I bought the backpack because there's something wrong with me. Do I regret buying the backpack? Yeah. If I could go back in time and not buy the backpack, I mean, if I had the possibility of doing that over again, I wouldn't buy the backpack. And I definitely wouldn't lose the receipt. You see? There's those three things. So, number 1, to eliminating shame, you have to understand without any uncertainty what it is. Number 2, you must come to recognize that shame is something you're really carrying around in your heart. Do we got that? First, you understand what shame is without any uncertainty whatsoever. Secondly, in order to eliminate it, you have to recognize it's there. You have to recognize that it's really something you're carrying around inside of you. After all, you can't eliminate what you don't recognize. Is that not true? Number 3, to eliminating shame. You must work to understand how the shame got there in the first place. Okay? The third step to eliminating shame, you must work to understand how it got there in the first place. To help you with this, I want to explain to you that children aren't naturally born with shame. Let's go back to all the babies being born today. How many of them do you think are being born believing they're shameful? 0 of them. 0 babies being born today, on the day that we're recording this show, are born believing that they're shameful. So nobody is born believing this. You weren't born believing this. Somebody had to communicate the messages that made you feel shame for the shame to get there. And then you had to believe that and adopt it as reality. So let's explain that again. No child is born believing that they are shameful. You're not naturally born that way. Somebody has to communicate the message that makes children feel shame in order for it to get there in the first place. And then children believe the message, and then they adopt that message as being reality, as being the truth. All right, so that's number 3. You have to work to understand how the shame got implanted there. And what does that involve? It involves looking very truthfully, painfully truthfully, at your parents and their attitudes. Number 4, once you recognize and fully understand that your parents communicated that you are devoid of worth, once you recognize and fully understand that your parents communicated that you're shameful, you must work to accept that this was abusive of them, that they abused you. This is really hard for a lot of people who discover me for the first time because they rebel against this thought. But there's just no way around it. If you have an emotional disorder, it is based on shame, and that shame got communicated by your parents. Therefore, you were abused by your parents. You were emotionally abused by them. There is no getting better. There's no eliminating the shame if you cannot come to recognize the plain truth about what your parents did. In other words, there's no hanging on to the idea that, your parents are not that responsible for it, or they're only partly responsible for it, or only one parent is responsible for it. No, no, no. If you really want to get rid of the shame, you got to be honest. You got to be painfully honest and accept that your parents communicated that you're devoid of worth or that you're shameful. It's the same thing. And then you must work to accept that this was inexcusable of them, no matter who they are, no matter how smart they are, no matter their education, no matter their social status, no matter the era they grew up in, no matter what, you must work to accept that this was abuse. You have to see the abuse for what it is and not reject the idea because because you care for these people and you don't want to believe it's true to spare your perception of them, or to spare your preference of them. Do you see how important that is? It's not a blame game. It's not a matter of blaming people. It's a matter of seeing a thing for what it really is. That's acceptance. So it's not, a judgmental type of blaming thing, pointing the finger at your parents and saying, you did this to me. No, it's simply seeing what they did for what it really is. Number 5, you must then come to accept that not only was it abuse on their part, but it was inexcusable. It was inexcusable of them as parents who were fully responsible for protecting and caring for your emotional needs. Let's put it in context. You were dependent on them. They weren't dependent on you or anybody else. They were grown adults with the capacity to take care of their own needs and also take care of your needs in the right way, and they failed. When we say something is inexcusable, what we mean, literally, is that there is no explanation in the entire universe which excuses that behavior or failure or action. All right, so number 5 is you have to come to accept that what your parents did was inexcusable. You have to put it into context. It doesn't matter when they were born. It doesn't matter what was going on in the broader society of the world when they were born, or culture. Culture doesn't excuse it. Why? Because in every culture, in every era, in every time, in every place, since the beginning of the world, there have been people who raised their children healthfully. All right, so you grew up in the 60s, and a lot of dads were abusive in the 60s. It don't matter, because in the 60s there were plenty of families, plenty of parents raising their children healthfully. So, number 5 is come to accept that their failure was inexcusable. As parents, whose primary responsibility was to you and your emotional, mental, and physical well-being. Number 6, to eliminate in shame. You must come to accept that the past cannot be changed. And then process the hurt of these realities, which simply requires more acceptance. In other words, you look back, you say, my parents did this. They abused me. It was inexcusable of them. And nothing can change it. It just is what it is. And then come to accept that. I explain to people that acceptance is like coming to terms with the death of somebody we love. It doesn't mean we agree with it. You know, when we lose somebody we love, the mourning period, the period where we're mourning that loss, is a form of denial because we don't want it to be true. Our hearts tell us it can't be true. And it's very painful. But how do people go on to live content lives afterward? They process that loss, and they come to accept that this is simply the new reality that they're living in. And this allows them to look forward to the future with this as the new reality, these circumstances. So, you must come to accept that your parents did what they did, it was wrong, and nothing can change it. And this will allow you to look to the future with a clear perspective on what really happened, what the reality of the situation is, and to move forward. Number 7, in the steps to eliminating shame. Once you've processed these painful realities and come to terms with them, in other words, once you've applied acceptance to this, you can then reject the messages that your adult caregivers improperly programmed into you as being lies that were never supposed to be there inside of you in the first place. You see how we're coming back around. You were born not believing that you were inherently without worth. And now we're returning to that. You see, as you go along, understanding that message was improperly programmed into you, was that education, that emotional education was improperly taught to you, as you go along, being consciously aware that that belief is there and seeing how it affects your behaviors and stuff, you're going to see that it's a lie. And the more that you see that it's a lie, it will not be hard to reject the lies. You see how that works? Once you go along, recognizing the lie of it, how it's a lie, and consciously being aware of how it's influencing you, well, then it's not going to be hard to reject that message. And as you do this, you'll get better and better at it, and eventually the lie at the base of all that, at the foundation, will begin to dissolve, and it'll be replaced by the reality that as a person, you have inherent value. So yeah, it seems very lengthy and complicated, but it's really not. It's a process. And so you simply go one step at a time and you take your time. So I've given you many subtle points to consider, and I hope you'll spend a lot of time thinking deeply about this. Much of the work of healing and recovering and ridding yourself of these emotional disorders is taking time to slowly digest accurate information, such as the information I've given you here today. I thought that I would close with some information that's just fun. It's not got to do anything with emotional health. Well, it does indirectly, but not directly. A lot of people want to know what it is I like so much about being in the woods. And I thought that, talking a little bit about this would give my listeners some insight into who I am and what I'm all about. So it can't hurt. The aspect of nature that truly excites me, really, isn't anything specifically seen. Although, I've seen some pretty spectacular things. Rather, it's the whole experience. It's something experienced and felt, the result of all the senses enjoying the surroundings out there in the wilderness. And I'm a little different, I think, than most people you'll talk to who enjoy going out into the woods. For example, I don't enjoy hiking, and I don't do hiking. Hiking is when you walk in the woods for a little bit. That's all it is, just walking around in the woods for a little bit, and then you go back to your parked car. And, 20 minutes later, you're back in civilization, sitting in air conditioning, or in a heated environment, watching a big screen television. So what experience does hiking really provide? Nothing really. I mean, you never really genuinely escaped one environment for another to experience a real contrast and to authentically and fully absorb what nature has to offer and then grow from it and evolve and be forced into a fresh, new mindset full of fresh, new perspectives. Frankly, the idea of hiking sort of seems pointless to me. I often crudely compare hiking to having sex with no intention to have an orgasm. I mean, it's nice and all, but you're not ever experiencing the real meat of it, You got to stay out there for a while, for the full experience. Hiking is like half-heartedly going through the motions of a genuine experience with no intention of following through on the experience. Now, I've explained this in the past. I'm going to explain it again. I grew up in Appalachian wilderness. Think outhouses and no running water. In fact, until I was, I think, 19 or 20, we had no running water in the house. We did. We had a well dug, and we would pump that well water into the house. But it was so rusty, it was so full of iron that we couldn't use it for anything. So, for my entire life, until I was 19 years old, my chore every night was to go down over the hill. There was a freshwater spring, and that freshwater spring was just a hole in the ground. You could put your arm in it and touch the bottom. The water would only come up to about your shoulder if you're a 10-year-old. So it was my job every night to go down to this freshwater spring, which bubbled up naturally out of the ground. With 2 buckets, I would haul up 2 buckets back to the house, and we would use that water to drink, wash with, and cook with. There was a probably 1,000 acres around us of untouched forest for us to get lost in as kids. And every day we would get lost in those woods. I don't mean literally lost. I just mean that we would get so far deep into the woods, exploring and stuff and playing, that my parents couldn't have found us even if they had a tracking device attached to our breeches. So I grew up with genuine intimacy with the forest. And to this day, I feel more comfortable in the woods than anywhere else because they're my most familiar surroundings. I get anxious when I get into a city with all the concrete and stuff. And it's interesting because so many people live in the cities nowadays that city people, when they think about being in the wilderness, this makes them anxious. Isn't that interesting? Because it goes against what they're most familiar with. And you see how it works in reverse for me? When I go into the city, it's what I'm less familiar with. And so naturally I feel some anxiety. But out in the wilderness, I'm very familiar with the way things work out there and very comfortable. There was one summer in particular when my brother and I took an old cotton canvas military pup tent and we pitched it back in the middle of the woods, and there's where that tent stayed for the entire summer. And my brother and I slept in that pup tent every night for the entire summer, just the two of us. I think I was 10 years old, which would have made my brother about 6 years old. So bedtime would roll around, we'd grab our stuff, and we'd head back to this tent in the middle of the woods. And that's where we slept all summer long. And our parents allowed this because they had grown up, in similar environments. And so the woods and our life within the woods was just a natural way of things. I didn't think much about it. I didn't think my life was different than anybody else's life. I mean, I knew people lived in the cities, but it was just such a natural part of life that I kind of took it for granted all the years growing up. It was just the way things were, I didn't question it much. And I share the story about my brother and I sleeping in that tent because I often think back to how much I grew in my understanding of the natural world during that summer. What a fantastic experience it was. Genuine intimacy, rubbing noses with the natural world without anybody's interference every night. And, it was a different world at night in the woods than during the day. During that year, I did a lot of pondering and questioning and exploring the more profound aspects of life and what it all means. And in my early 20s, I left the woods behind. I set out on my own for a new experience, life in the big cities. And so large cities are where I've lived ever since for the most part. And I still personally own a few acres of woods where I grew up. When I become an adult, I was allowed to go select a few acres for myself. And I selected an undisturbed portion, very remote, that I was particularly fond of as a child. And so now those belong to me, and my family still owns the rest of the acreage. So I can still go back and lose myself in those woods whenever I get the itch. But I've also evolved in that I enjoy getting out and exploring new wilderness areas that I have no experience with at all. And this is where wilderness backpacking has really filled a need for me. It allows me to go out for many days and nights at a time, escape the city, and tap back into the isolation, wonder, exploration, and intimacy with nature that I enjoyed as a boy. So this is the aspect of being out in nature that most thrills me, the returning to what is most familiar and comfortable to me. It's where my soul gets refreshed and all of life's distractions are drowned out. On wilderness excursions, when I'm out there backpacking, I'm not thinking about the rising price of gasoline or which group is protesting whatever issue of the week. I'm not answering text messages or phone calls because there's no phone service or data service in the places where I go. So the only things on my mind are the tasks immediately at hand, depending on my changing, uncontrollable environment. And beyond this, things of genuine substance, like what kind of life am I living? Am I the person I want to be? What practical steps might I take to improve myself? Where am I at in the stream of my life, in the stream of time? Am I making the best of it? And of course, next to a crackling campfire at night with no other people around for miles, I play around with deep thoughts about God and about science, the nature of life and the universe. And usually a bottle of Kentucky bourbon comes out. And if I have company, all these thoughts translate into some of the richest conversations of my life. So it's this experience, all of it, which excites me the most about being in the wilderness. It enriches my life experience very, very much. And I truly feel pity for people who are so disconnected from the natural world that they'll hear this and not have the faintest notion of the things I'm referring to. Only being familiar with and absorbed in human-manipulated environments and experiences is a certain way to end up with distorted, unhealthy perceptions and thinking. But intimacy, genuine intimacy with nature, is a powerful counterbalance for that.